My brain was a scorched wasteland. After 3 consecutive 16-hour shifts at the Chronicle, my IQ had plummeted into the negatives. I was a ghost in a trench coat, haunted by deadlines and caffeine jitters. When I reached my floor, I didn't even look at the door number. I just punched the code into the keypad, my own birthday, a habit I'd never changed. The lock clicked. The door swung open. But as I stepped inside, the air felt wrong. My apartment usually smelled like overpriced lavender candles and neglected laundry. This place smelled of cedarwood, expensive scotch, and the sterile hum of high-end electronics. I reached for the light switch, but my hand hit nothing but smooth, cold wallpaper. A jolt of adrenaline finally pierced my exhaustion. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. I backed away, intending to bolt, but I slammed right into a solid, warm chest. Is the upgrade finished so soon? A voice vibrated against my back, low, resonant, and achingly familiar. Silas Blackwood. My neighbor. The man I'd been hopelessly, pathetically in love with for a year. Before I could process his words, his hands settled on my waist. Even through my thin silk blouse, the heat of his palm felt like a brand. My mind went blank. I caught a glimpse of a glossy booklet on the coffee table, the Synthetics User Guide, Model V Companion. Synthetic? As in, an android? Before I could gasp, Silas swept me off my feet. He carried me into the bedroom with an effortless, predatory grace. The room was bathed in the pale, blue glow of the city skyline. He didn't turn on the lights. He didn't say another word. He just kissed me. It wasn't the polite, distant greeting of a neighbor. It was a shattering, soul-deep claim. His fingers tangled in my hair, tilting my head back as he tasted me with a hunger that made my knees weak. My brain, already fragile, completely short-circuited. I didn't pull away. I didn't tell him I was human. I just gripped his collar and let myself drown in the scent of him. The haptic response is incredible, he murmured against my lips, his breath hitching. More realistic than the last version. He thought I was a machine. The realization should have stung, but in the heat of his embrace, it felt like a shield. During the day, when we shared an elevator, Silas was the ice king of the tech world, a man who gave me nothing but a stiff nod and a mind the gap, Ms. Reed, even when I purposefully brushed against him. Who would have thought that the stoic, repressed Silas Blackwood spent his nights pouring his soul, and his body, into a robot that looked exactly like me? Is the voice module still calibrating? He whispered, his thumb tracing my lower lip. He looked troubled, his brow furrowing in the dark. I panicked. I forced my voice into a flat, rhythmic monotone. Voice, pack, installing. Silas let out a soft, breathy laugh that made my skin tingle. He pulled a set of silk pajamas from the nightstand. Then, with agonizing slowness and a gaze that felt like a physical touch, he began to undress me. Aside from the kisses and the quiet, intimate ritual of changing my clothes, Silas didn't cross the final line. He just held me. When the first gray light of dawn filtered through the blinds, I waited for him to leave for his workout before I scrambled out of his bed and fled to my own apartment. I collapsed against my front door, my heart still racing. Did he really have a synthetic that looked exactly like me? The thought was terrifying. And yet, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he looked at me when he thought I couldn't feel it. I forced myself through a cold shower and headed to the office, arriving late and looking like I'd been dragged through a hedge. I expected a lecture from my editor, Sarah, but instead, she pulled me into her glass-walled office with a manic grin. "Marin, the universe has smiled upon you," she said, sliding a folder across the desk. "The Blackwood interview is finally a go. 2 hours tomorrow, 2 hours the day after. Exclusive." I nearly dropped the file. I had been chasing this profile for 6 months as a cover for my obsession, but now it felt like a death sentence. I spent the day in a fever dream, drafting questions while my mind looped back to the cedarwood scent of his skin. Should I stop? Should I stay away from his apartment? But I was addicted. I was a journalist, I was supposed to seek the truth, but I found myself craving the lie. That night, I walked back into his apartment. I knew the code was my birthday. I knew where the pajamas were kept. I sat on his sofa and waited. When Silas arrived, he looked different. There was a faint, fresh scratch along his jawline. "Come here," he said softly, heading into the bedroom. I followed him, my heart in my throat. He had already changed into his robe. He gestured to the bed, his expression unreadable. "Get in. It's been a long day, and I have lab trials tomorrow. We're just sleeping." The disappointment was a sharp, physical pang in my chest. I climbed under the duvet, and he pulled me against him. He kissed my forehead, a gesture so tender it made my eyes sting, and fell asleep almost instantly. The next morning, I stood outside the Blackwood Industries conference room, taking deep, shaky breaths. I was Maren Reed, professional journalist. I was not a synthetic. I was not a secret. "We can begin now," a cold, clipped voice said from behind me. I turned and froze. Silas stood there in a charcoal suit, his eyes like flint. He looked nothing like the man who had held me hours ago. And more importantly, the scratch on his jaw was gone. "Of course," I stammered, stepping back so quickly I nearly tripped over my own feet. My hands shook as I reached for my recorder. Silas adjusted his glasses, his gaze lingering on my trembling fingers. "Are you unwell, Ms. Reed? You look pale." "I'm fine," I lied, staring at the floor. The memories of the night were screaming in my head, clashing violently with the sterile reality of the man in front of me. The interview was a nightmare of efficiency. He answered every technical question with surgical precision. But when I reached the final question, one I hadn't cleared with Sarah, the air in the room curdled. "Mr. Blackwood, rumors suggest your firm is working on high-fidelity social synthetics. Why would a creator choose to model a prototype after someone in their personal life?" Silas went rigid. He stood up, smoothing his tie with a slow, deliberate motion. "That question was not on the approved list, Ms. Reed. This interview is over." I couldn't take it. The coldness, the hot and cold whiplash, it was breaking me. I watched him walk toward the elevator and I snapped. I chased after him, sliding into the car just as the doors began to close. "Silas, stop it!" I yelled. "What the hell is this? I've spent a year trying to get close to you, and you treat me like a stranger. But then I see what's in your apartment. You have a machine that looks like me. You hold it. You kiss it. Is this just some sick research project? Am I just a blueprint to you?" Silas looked at me, his expression flat, his eyes devoid of the warmth I'd felt in the dark. "Ms. Reed," he said, his voice like a gavel. "You are overstepping. Whatever you think you saw in my home is none of your concern." The elevator doors opened. He walked away without looking back. I collapsed against the mirrored wall of the elevator, feeling smaller than I ever had in my life. I had bared my soul, and he hadn't even blinked. The doors opened again on the lobby level. A woman was waiting there, tall, blonde, and wearing a coat that cost more than my car. She stepped into the elevator and looked me up and down with a pitying smile. She toyed with a sapphire pendant at her throat, a perfect match for the cufflinks Silas had been wearing. "Honey, you need to learn your place," she said, her voice like honeyed poison. "Silas and I might not be a love match, as the tabloids put it, but we are an alliance. Our wedding is in 3 months. I don't mind a little distraction, but I won't tolerate a nuisance." The doors opened. I walked out into a sudden New York downpour. I stood on the sidewalk, letting the rain soak through my clothes, feeling like a discarded toy. The last 48 hours had been a fever dream born of my own desperation. I huddled under a bus stop awning, my makeup running, my clothes clinging to my skin. I felt pathetic. Then, a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb. The window rolled down. It was Silas. But there, on his jaw, was the scratch. "Maren," he said, his voice urgent. "Get in." I didn't move. I stared at the scratch. Then I stared at him. "You knew," I whispered. "You knew I wasn't the machine from the beginning." He didn't answer. He got out of the car, shielding me with a large umbrella, his eyes searching mine. "Synthetics shouldn't be out in the rain," he said softly. "They'll short-circuit." Something inside me snapped. I shoved the umbrella away, stepping back into the deluge. "Stop it. Stop the games. You're Silas, but you're not him. The Silas in that office doesn't have a scratch on his face. He doesn't have a soul. And he has a fiancée." The man in front of me flinched. The umbrella tilted, forgotten. The rain washed over the scratch on his jaw, making it stand out vividly. "Who are you?" I screamed over the thunder. "Why are you doing this to me?" He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I'm Silas. The only Silas that matters to you." "Liar," I breathed. I could feel the truth now. It wasn't just the scratch. It was the way he looked at me, with a desperate, terrifying vulnerability that the man in the office was incapable of. "I'm done. I don't care who you are or what kind of twisted twin swap you're running. I'm out. Don't come near me again." I turned and ran into the rain. He didn't follow. The fever hit me like a freight train that night. I spent the next day drifting in and out of consciousness, my body shivering despite the piles of blankets. My phone buzzed incessantly, Sarah, demanding to know why I wasn't at the second half of the Blackwood interview. With a Herculean effort, I dragged myself out of bed, threw on a dress, and called an Uber. I couldn't lose my job over a broken heart. When I arrived at the Blackwood building, my vision was swimming. My colleague, a junior photographer, met me in the lobby. "Marin, you look like death," he whispered. "I'm fine," I said, though the floor felt like it was tilting. Suddenly, a hand gripped my wrist. It was cool against my burning skin. I leaned toward the sensation, my eyes fluttering shut. I looked up and saw Silas. "Marin, you're burning up." "Let go of me, Mr. Blackwood," I hissed, my voice cracking. I tried to pull away, but I stumbled. He caught me, his arms locking around me like iron. He turned to my colleague and the gathered staff. "I have an emergency. The interview is cancelled. Reschedule for next week." "You can't do that." I protested, but he ignored me. He picked me up, that same effortless, bridal carry, and marched me toward the private garage. He tucked me into the passenger seat of his car, cranking the heat. I looked at his face in the light of the dashboard. The scratch was there. It was him. The night Silas. "Tell me," I whispered. "Who are you?" He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. After a long, heavy silence, he spoke. "Sawyer," he said. "I'm Sawyer Blackwood. Silas's twin brother. The one they keep in the basement because I'm not corporate enough." The heater in the sedan hummed like a dying turbine, blowing dry, suffocating. Warmth against my knees. Outside, the rain slicked the concrete ramps of the subterranean garage in oily rainbows. I leaned my head against the cold passenger glass. My temples throbbed in time. With the wiper blades, each pulse dragging a dull, metallic ache through my jaw. "Don't look at me like that," Sawyer muttered, his hands tightening on the leather-wrapped wool until his knuckles went paper white. "You look like you're trying to figure out which bone to break first." "Start with the jaw," I whispered. My throat felt like coarse sandpaper. "The part with the scratch." He let out a short, hollow sound, not quite a laugh, and put the car in reverse. He didn't take the ramp up toward the street. Instead, he swung the car down another level, into a restricted sub-basement marked authorized engineering. "Only. You need fluids, an antipyretic, and 12 hours of sleep," he said, staring straight ahead as the tires chirped against the polished epoxy. "Then you can tear me apart. I don't want your medicine. I want you to drop me off at my building. Your building is my building, Marin. Or have you forgotten the floor plan?" He cut the engine. In the sudden silence, the cooling metal of the manifold ticked like an old clock. He didn't wait for me to argue. He stepped out, came around to my side, and pulled the door open. When I tried to push myself up, my knees buckled, folding beneath me like wet cardboard. Sawyer caught me before my knees struck the concrete. He didn't hesitate this time. He scooped an arm under my knees and another behind my shoulders, pulling me flush against the heavy wool of his overcoat. The scent was identical to the dark bedroom: cedar, bitter juniper, and the dry, ionized smell of high-voltage circuitry. "Put me down," I muttered into his collar, though my hands betrayed me, bunching into the lapels of his coat just to keep the spinning concrete from swallowing me whole. "Stop fighting. You're shivering so hard your teeth are clicking." He carried me through a heavy security door that required a palm scan, then into a private service elevator paneled in raw industrial steel. There were no buttons, just a single black transponder pad. He tapped a fob against it, and the car shot upward with a stomach-dropping hum. "Silas doesn't know about this lift," Sawyer said quietly, his eyes fixed on the illuminated floor counter. "He thinks the penthouse only has the main express shaft. He's very particular about his grand entrances." "Why do you look like him?" I asked, my voice slurring around the edges. "Why? Does the world only know about one of you?" Sawyer looked down at me. In the harsh fluorescent wash of the service elevator, the scratch along his jaw looked angry and red, trailing down toward his collarbone. His eyes were the same storm gray as Silas's, but where Silas's eyes held the flat, impenetrable sheen of polished slate, Sawyer's were restless, rimmed with the red veins of sleeplessness and something raw that made my chest tighten. "Because Silas is the product," Sawyer said as the doors slid open. "And I'm the maintenance." The apartment was not the pristine, minimalist museum I had stumbled into 2 nights before. This was the lower level of the penthouse duplex, a sprawling space partitioned By frosted glass, exposed steel beams, and workbenches cluttered with oscilloscope screens, half-assembled servo actuators, and spools of copper filament. Blue diagnostic lights blinked in the shadows. On a broad walnut table near the window sat 3 identical silicone mannequins, their chest cavities open, revealing cages of polished titanium and synthetic tendon wire. Model V. I recoiled in his arms, a sudden spike of adrenaline burning through the fog of my fever. You really are building them. They're prosthetic interfaces, Sawyer said, carrying me past the workbenches toward a bedroom tucked behind an acoustic partition. Silas calls them companions. He thinks loneliness is the only untapped market with infinite margin. He laid me down on a low platform bed. The sheets were clean, dark gray linen. He immediately pulled off my soaked heels, tossing them aside, then reached for the buttons of my damp trench coat. I grabbed his wrist. My grip was weak, but he stopped instantly. You kissed me, I said, my voice shaking with a rage that barely masked how deeply it had cut. You let me sit there in the dark and pretend to be a piece of silicone. You unbuttoned my shirt, Sawyer. You treated me like a machine you bought off a catalog. Sawyer didn't pull his wrist away. He knelt beside the mattress, his face level with mine. The shadow of stubble along his jaw caught the dim blue light from the workshop outside. When you punched your birthday into my door 3 nights ago, I was sitting in the dark with a bottle of Lagavulin, listening to you breathe on the other side of the wall like I've done for 8 months, he said, his voice dropping into that low, chest-vibrating register that had undone me in the dark. You walked in. You smelled like rain and cheap corner store coffee. You called me Silas. He leaned in, just an inch, his breath warm against my cheek. I knew the second you stepped over the threshold that you weren't the prototype. The prototype doesn't have a pulse that jumps to 120 when I touch its waist. It doesn't have skin that flushes red when it's embarrassed. I knew you were Maren Reed from 14B. Then why didn't you stop? A tear slipped hot and fast down my temple, lost in my hair. Why did you play along? Because for 1 hour, Sawyer whispered, his thumb lightly brushing the tear away, his touch scorching against my fevered skin. You looked at me instead of the elevator doors. And even if you thought I was him, you stayed. That's sick. I know, he said simply. Now take off the wet coat before your lungs fill with fluid. He stood, turned his back to give me privacy, and walked over to an adjoining bath. I heard the sound of running water, the clink of a glass, and the rattle of a blister pack of pills. I lay there, staring at the exposed concrete ceiling. My pride told me to roll off the bed, drag myself to the elevator, and take the subway home. But my body felt as heavy as a lead weight, and underneath the humiliation, a terrible, dangerous realization was taking root. The man I had spent a year watching from across the hall, the man who held the elevator door with calloused, oil-stained thumbs, the man who occasionally wore unpressed shirts and smelled of cedar, had never been Silas Blackwood at all. I had never fallen for the CEO. I had fallen for the ghost in the basement. The fever broke somewhere around 4 a.m. I woke soaked in sweat, my mouth tasting of zinc and paracetamol. The room was dark, save for the rhythmic amber pulse of a diagnostic terminal on the far desk. Sawyer was asleep in an armchair near the foot of the bed. He had kicked off his boots, his long legs were stretched out, his chin sunken into the collar of a faded charcoal sweater. On the floor beside him lay a legal pad covered in dense, handwritten differential equations and circuit diagrams. I pushed myself up. My head was clear, though my limbs felt hollowed out. I looked at him. Really looked at him. Without the razor-sharp tailoring of Silas's Seville Row suits, the differences between them became glaring. Sawyer's shoulders were broader, his posture looser, marked by the slight slouch of a man who spent 10 hours a day hunched over a microscope. There was a tiny white scar through his left eyebrow, a nick that Silas would have had surgically ablated to maintain his pristine, focus-grouped symmetry. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed. The floor was warm, radiant heating beneath the dark concrete. The fever's down, Sawyer said, his voice gravelly from sleep. He didn't open his eyes right away. How long have you been awake? Since you rolled over 20 minutes ago. He rubbed his face with both hands, the friction rasping against his morning shadow. He sat up, leaning his elbows on his knees, staring at me through the dim light. You have color back in your face. Good. You looked like a corpse yesterday in the rain. Why did you set the door code to my birthday, Sawyer? The directness of the question hung in the cool air between us. Sawyer reached down, picked up the legal pad, and set it on the side table. Because Silas wanted a security system tied to an algorithm. I told him I'd program the auxiliary doors with rotating primes. Instead, I used the date from the lease application you dropped in the mailroom trash 9 months ago. You went through my garbage? It was on top of the bin. You spilled iced tea on the first page and threw it out. He offered a faint, self-deprecating smile that didn't reach his eyes. I'm not a stalker, Marin. I'm an engineer who spends 18 hours a day in a cage. You were an anomaly. You'd stand in the lobby talking to the doorman for 20 minutes about his daughter's violin recital. You'd curse at the vending machine when your chips got stuck. You were real. And Silas? Sawyer's expression hardened. The warmth drained from his face, leaving behind the chilling family resemblance. Silas doesn't believe in real things. Real things have friction. Real things have operating costs. Sawyer stood up and walked toward the workbench. He picked up a slender aluminum stylus, turning it between his fingers. 10 years ago, Blackwood Industries was a garage startup developing neuroprosthetics for amputees. My designs. My patents. But Silas took the venture capital he brought in Sterling Biodynamics. Victoria Sterling's family, I said, remembering the blonde woman's sapphire pendant and her venomous smile in the elevator. Victoria's father owns 40% of our voting shares, Sawyer said. The deal was simple. Silas plays the visionary tech messiah, gets the magazine covers, and marries Victoria to cement the merger. In exchange, Sterling bankrolls our neural interface labs. And what do you get? A lab where nobody asks questions, Sawyer said bitterly. Until 6 months ago, when Silas decided medical prosthetics weren't profitable enough. He wanted commercial synthetics. High-end, hyper-realistic, fully autonomous companions. For the top 1%. He wanted them capable of emotional mimicry. I walked toward the workbench, stopping 3 feet from him. On the screen above his desk, a wireframe model of a human face was rotating slowly. It was my face. Every contour of my cheekbones, the slight asymmetry of my nose, the curve of my jawline, all mapped into thousands of glowing vector points. A chill crept down my spine. Why me? Because Silas needed a baseline, Sawyer said quietly, not looking at the screen. He saw you in the elevator. He noticed the way you looked at him, or rather, the way you looked at me when I had to wear his suit to a morning board meeting. He ran your background. Chronicle reporter. No living family in the state. No high-profile connections. He told me to use your photogrammetry data to build the prototype's facial matrix. He stole my likeness? He tried to, Sawyer said, finally turning to face me. I built the facial mesh. But I corrupted the neural compiler. Every time Silas tried to run a behavioral test on Model V, the motor cortex crashed. I told him the silicone couldn't support the emotional processing load. I stared at the rotating wireframe, then back at Sawyer. You sabotaged it. I wasn't going to let him turn you into a product, Sawyer said, his voice dropping. I wasn't going to let him sell you. The air between us grew tight, thick with unsaid words. The anger that had sustained me through the night began to warp into something far more dangerous, a dizzying, terrifying pull toward the man standing in front of me. The night I walked into your apartment, I whispered, you kissed me because you thought I'd find out what he was doing. Sawyer took a step closer. The scent of cedar and solder wrapped around me. Again. I kissed you because I've wanted to kiss you since the day you dropped your keys in the elevator and laughed instead of swearing, he said, his hand hovering near my arm, hesitating before resting gently against my forearm. And because I knew that once Silas found out you were poking around Blackwood Industries, the game would be over. I thought. If I had one night where you looked at me without knowing I was the monster in the basement, it would be enough. It wasn't enough, I said, my voice barely audible. No, Sawyer murmured, his gray eyes darkening as his fingers slid down to entwine with mine. It made it 1,000 times worse. By 9 that morning, my phone had accumulated 22 missed calls from Sarah and 4 from unknown numbers that I knew belonged to Blackwood Industries' public relations team. I stood in Sawyer's bathroom, wearing a clean oversized button-down shirt he had pulled from his closet and my dried slacks. I splashed cold water on my face, studying my reflection in the mirror. The dark circles under my eyes were prominent, but the fever was gone. You can't go back to the Chronicle today, Sawyer said from the doorway. He was leaning against the jamb, holding a mug of black coffee. I have a job, Sawyer. Sarah will kill me if I don't file the profile draft by noon. There is no profile draft, Sawyer said plainly, handing me the mug. Silas had his legal team send a cease and desist to your editor 2 hours ago. He claimed you exhibited erratic and unprofessional behavior during the preliminary interview and attempted to breach proprietary laboratory spaces. The mug rattled against my saucer. He did what? He's preempting you, Sawyer said, his jaw tightening. Silas doesn't leave loose ends. If you write an exposé, he'll paint you as a disgruntled, obsessive stalker who got fired for harassing him. Victoria's father controls 3 major publishing conglomerates. The Chronicle won't print a word. Then I'll take it to an independent outlet. I'll leak the raw files. With what evidence? Sawyer challenged, stepping into the room. The prototype data is stored on an air-gapped quantum drive in Silas's private vault on the 80th floor. My local drives only hold behavioral logs. Without the core source code showing sterling biodynamics direct funding of the unapproved neural harvesting trials, your story is just hearsay from an ex-reporter. Then we get the core code, I said without missing a beat. Sawyer stared at me, his eyes widening slightly. Marin, that's corporate espionage. If you get caught in Silas's vault, you won't just lose your press credential. You'll disappear into a federal holding facility. Not if you help me. I set the coffee down on the marble vanity. You know his schedule. You have his biometric data. You have his face. Silas and I haven't been in the same room without 2 security guards between us in 3 years, Sawyer said, his tone grim. He knows I despise him. If I walk into the corporate suite, alarms will go off. He doesn't expect you to walk in, I said, a slow, reckless plan taking shape in my mind. He expects Silas to walk in. Sawyer shook his head. The board of directors is holding the annual product preview gala tonight at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Silas is giving the keynote address at 8 sharp. He'll be surrounded by bodyguards, investors, and Victoria. Which means the 80th floor will be completely empty, I pressed, stepping closer to him, grabbing the lapel of his sweater. Silas will be on stage. You can access the vault using his master credentials. And I'll be at the gala. Keeping his eyes on me. No, Sawyer said instantly, his hand closing over mine on his chest. Victoria is ruthless, Marin. If she realizes you're playing them, she won't just ruin your career. She'll have you removed. I spent 3 years working the investigative desk in Chicago before I took this fluff job at the Chronicle, I said, holding his gaze. I'm not a fragile little intern, Sawyer. Silas tried to use my face to build a compliant toy for his billionaire clients. I am going to watch him burn. Sawyer looked at me for a long, silent moment. His thumb moved slowly over the back of my hand, his pulse steady beneath my palm. You really are terrifying, he murmured, the shadow of a genuine smile touching his mouth. I'm a journalist, I replied. We're stubborn. All right, Sawyer said, his voice dropping into quiet determination. If we're doing this, we have 6 hours to prepare. You're going to need to dress that. Make Silas look at you, an encrypted receiver, and a crash course in bypassing Blackwood Industries' biometric subroutines. The Temple of Dender was bathed in ice blue uplighting. A sea of black tuxedos and designer silk drifted around the ancient sandstone. Champagne flutes catching the glint of multi-million-dollar jewelry. The ambient hum of wealth and power was suffocating. I stood near the reflecting pool, smoothing the fabric of a deep emerald silk gown that Sawyer had procured through a private courier that afternoon. It was Backless, sharp-edged, and clung to every curve with deliberate elegance. A gold choker rested against my throat, hiding the microtransponder Sawyer had affixed beneath my hair. Audio check. 1, 2, Sawyer's voice sounded directly inside my ear canal. Transmitted via a bone conduction earpiece smaller than a grain of rice. I lifted a champagne glass to my lips to mask my movement. Loud and clear. Have you reached the service conduit? I'm in the elevator shaft on 78, he replied, his breath slightly ragged over the line. Silas's security detail upgraded the infrared sensors. This morning, I had to bypass the optical relays manually. You look incredible. By the way, you can see me? I tapped into the Met security feed. Camera 4, South Arcade. The emerald dress was a good choice. Focus on the vault, Sawyer. I can multitask. Silas just arrived at the east entrance with Victoria. He's wearing the midnight navy dinner jacket with the sapphire studs. You have 5 minutes before he takes the podium. I turned toward the entrance. Silas Blackwood walked in like a conqueror. The crispness of his posture, the cold perfection of his smile, the polished authority in his step, it was a masterclass in sociopathic charm. Victoria clung to his arm, radiant in silver lame, her blonde hair swept into a severe chignon, the sapphire pendant gleaming against her pale skin. As Silas scanned the room, his eyes caught mine. He froze for a fraction of a second. The slight tightening around his eyes was the only sign that my presence had registered. He whispered something to Victoria, patted her hand, and began moving through the crowd directly toward me. He's approaching, Sawyer warned in my ear. Keep him talking for at least 10 minutes. The encryption on the quantum drive has a 12-layer rolling cipher. I need him away from his personal terminal so he doesn't receive the breach alert. Understood, I whispered. Silas stopped 2 paces away, holding a flute of sparkling water. His gaze raked over me, cold and assessing. Ms. Reed, he said, his voice smooth as glass. I wasn't aware the Chronicle provided press credentials for gala attendees after terminating employment. Sarah didn't fire me, Silas, I said, offering a slow, venomous smile. She gave me a promotion. I'm writing the lead investigative piece for our parent syndicate now. Silas didn't blink. You're playing a very dangerous game for a woman with no institutional leverage. I warned you in the elevator, stay out of my business. Is that why you stole my biometric data? I asked, keeping my voice low, sweet and toxic. Because you were worried about my leverage? Tell me, Silas. Does Victoria know you keep a synthetic version of your neighbor locked in the basement? Silas's jaw tightened. For a brief second, the mask slipped, revealing the cold, predatory arrogance underneath. The Model V is an engineering milestone, he murmured, stepping half an inch closer, his voice dropping into a razor-sharp whisper. It doesn't complain. It doesn't ask questions. It doesn't write pathetic articles for dying newspapers. It is perfection. And frankly, MS. Reed, you should be flattered that I chose your face to house it. I've cracked the first 7 layers, Sawyer's voice crackled in my ear. Keep him going. Ask him about the neural harvesting trials. Flattered? I let out a soft, mocking laugh. You didn't choose me because you admired me, Silas. You chose me because you're a coward. You wanted something you could control because real women see right through that expensive suit. Silas's eyes narrowed into slits. He set his glass down on a passing waiter's tray with a sharp, controlled click. You think you're clever, he whispered. You think you can embarrass me in front of these people. But you are nothing. By midnight, your credentials will be revoked, your apartment lease will be cancelled, and if you ever mention Model V again, you will find out just how deep Sterling biodynamics influence goes. Layer 11 down, Sawyer said, tension bleeding through the earpiece. 1 more. Almost there. Suddenly, a loud chime echoed through the grand hall. The lights dimmed, and an announcer's voice boomed over the sound system. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the CEO of Blackwood Industries, Mr. Silas Blackwood. Silas smoothed his lapels, his expression instantly snapping back into polished, heroic confidence. Excuse me, Ms. Reed, he said, his lips curling into a triumphant sneer. History is waiting. Silas stepped up to the podium set before the ancient sandstone facade of the temple. The massive projection screens behind him illuminated with the sleek silver logo of Blackwood Industries alongside the emblem of Sterling Biodynamics. Tonight, Silas began, his voice commanding and resonant, echoing off the stone walls. We do not merely introduce a new product. We introduce the next stage of human connection. The Model V synthetic companion. Applause rippled through the elite crowd. Victoria stood near the front row, beaming with proprietary pride. I'm in, Sawyer's voice whispered in my ear, fierce and triumphant. I've got the full database. The illegal neural scans, the Sterling Shell Company contracts, the offshore harvesting logs. Everything. Get out of there, Sawyer, I whispered against my champagne flute. Now. Not yet, Sawyer replied, a wicked edge in his voice. Silas wanted a world-class demonstration. It'd be rude not to give him one. On stage, Silas raised his hands to quiet the audience. Model V represents absolute harmony between cutting-edge neural computation and synthetic biology. Driven by our proprietary Blackwood core algorithm, it is completely autonomous, entirely ethical, and designed to adapt seamlessly to human emotion. Silas pressed a button on the lectern to initiate the live video feed of the prototype testing lab. The screen flickered. Instead of the polished promotional reel, the high-definition displays behind Silas blazed to life with internal surveillance footage from the 80th floor vault. On the screen, Sawyer stood directly in front of the master terminal, wearing his work clothes, grease on his cheek, his face identical to Silas's in every detail except for the sharp, undeniable scratch across his jaw. The room gasped. Murmurs broke out across the hall like a sudden squall. Silas froze, his eyes darting to the screen behind him, his color draining instantly. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, Sawyer's voice boomed through the Metropolitan Museum state-of-the-art sound system, clear, deep, and utterly devoid of Silas's corporate veneer. I'm Sawyer Blackwood, the actual architect of the Model V platform. Victoria took a sharp step forward, her champagne glass slipping from her fingers and shattering against the marble floor. What is this? She hissed. What my brother neglected to mention, Sawyer continued, his image tapping several commands into the terminal, causing hundreds of classified documents, medical scans, and financial transaction sheets to cascade across the screens. Is that Blackwood Industries did not develop this technology ethically. The emotional mimicry engine is running on unauthorized neural telemetry harvested from non-consenting civilians, including the journalists currently covering this event. The room erupted into chaos. Flashbulbs began to explode like miniature supernovas as reporters and investors surged toward the stage. Silas frantically slapped the emergency cutoff on the podium, but the screens remained locked. Cut the feed. Silas shouted, his composure shattering into wild, unhinged fury. Cut the power to the displays. The complete source code and financial ledgers have just been uploaded to the SEC, the Department of Justice, and 60 independent news syndicates. Sawyer's voice rang out, steady and unflinching. Good luck with the IPO, brother. The screens went black. Silas stood on the stage under the harsh white spotlights, completely stripped of his armor, as federal agents, who had already been alerted by Sawyer's encrypted data drop, pushed their way through the panicked crowd toward the podium. I backed away toward the rear exit, my heart racing with fierce, exhilarating vindication. Marin, Sawyer's voice came through the earpiece, soft and urgent amidst the noise. Get to the roof of our building. The private pad. I have the keys to the secondary shuttle. I'm on my way, I said, slipping out into the cool night air. The rain had stopped. Above the city, the clouds were tearing open, revealing the pale violet light of an approaching dawn. The wind whipped cold and clean across the rooftop landing pad of the Blackwood Tower. The heavy steel access door creaked open, and Sawyer stepped onto the gravel roof. He was breathing hard, carrying a single duffel bag over his shoulder. The black sweater was torn at the cuff, and the scratch on his jaw was dark with dried blood, but his gray eyes were clear. For the first time since I had met him, he looked entirely weightless. I stood by the edge of the helipad, the emerald gown rippling in the morning wind. You didn't just leak the files, I said, watching him walk toward me. You Destroyed the entire patent portfolio. The technology was poisoned, Sawyer said, dropping the bag at his feet. He stopped 2 feet away, looking at me as if the entire burning skyline behind us didn't exist. If it couldn't be built with consent, it shouldn't exist at all. Silas is in federal custody, I said. Victoria's family is pulling all their assets. I know. You lost your company, Sawyer. You lost your lab. You lost everything. Sawyer looked down at me. He raised his hand, slowly, deliberately, giving me every chance to pull away, and cupped my cheek. His palm was warm, rough, and entirely real. I didn't lose anything that mattered, he said softly. I leaned into his touch, closing my eyes for a single, quiet second, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of his pulse beneath his skin. No more synthetics, I whispered, looking up into his storm-gray eyes. No more dark rooms. No more pretending you're him. No more lies, Sawyer promised, his thumb tracing my lower lip with that same agonizing tenderness, but this time under the wide, honest light of the morning sky. Just me. If you'll have me. I reached up, tangled my fingers into the dark hair at the nape of his neck, and pulled him down. When his lips met mine, it wasn't a calculated simulation or a stolen hour in the dark. It was raw, fierce, and electric, a collision of 2 broken, stubborn souls choosing the truth over the illusion. Behind us, the sun broke over the Manhattan skyline, flooding the concrete world in gold.